tonight I'll be presenting on the revolutionary dialectics of Leninism. Throughout this presentation, I hope to provide clarity on the following areas. First, conscious and unconscious dialectical processes of revolution. Second, the natural laws of dialectical motion. Third, the relationship of these laws with the revolutionary energy of the masses. Fourth, the Leninist application of dialectics in channeling and focalizing this energy through revolutionary vanguardism. And finally, the respective roles of the masses and the vanguard in defending the revolution and initiating post-revolutionary society. So to start with a Trotsky quote, Marxism considers itself the conscious expression of the unconscious historical process. But the term unconscious process, in the historico-philosophical sense of the term, not in the psychological, coincides with its conscious expression only at its highest point, when the masses, by sheer elemental pressure, break through the social routine and give victorious expression to the deepest needs of historical development. And at such moments, the highest theoretical consciousness of the epoch merges with the immediate action of those oppressed masses who are farthest away from theory. The creative union of the conscious with the unconscious is what one calls inspiration. Revolution is the inspired frenzy of history, end quote. So this quote from Leon Trotsky reflects the general subject matter for my presentation this evening. The dialectical relationship between the unconscious forces of history and the conscious expression of those forces reflects the core theoretical breakthrough that was and still is Bolshevik Leninism, despite decades of distortion, misinterpretation, and misapplication by political theorists, historians, governments, bourgeois political parties, and Stalinists. So to start with the laws of dialectical motion and human development, Newtonian physics, also known as classical mechanics, describes the motion of macroscopic objects under the influence of forces, using Isaac Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation, which provide accurate approximation for forces of motion at everyday speeds and sizes. Even though the laws of classical mechanics break down at very high speeds, thereby necessitating the application of scientific laws such as relativity and quantum mechanics in high-speed circumstances, classical mechanics help illuminate the Marxist understanding of dialectical and historical motion throughout the history of human development. So natural or material conditions are forces which constantly act upon humanity and directly influence ongoing human development, including but not limited to political, economic, and social forces. Historical human development has always been a direct product of environmental conditions which act upon our species' capacity to meet fundamental needs such as food, water, shelter, and safety. All social, political, and economic development is a product of the dialectical relationship between conditions imposed upon humanity by nature and humanity's response to these conditions. So, of course, as well, evolution and natural selection play key dialectical roles, in human development. Evolutionary processes have fundamentally shaped human development, influencing physical characteristics, cognitive abilities, social behaviors, and so forth. Through natural selection, traits that enhance survival and reproduction become more prevalent over generations, thereby driving changes in the human lineage. The dialectical interplay between genes and the environment has led to unique human adaptations over the course of our historical development. So, despite being a historical culmination of human development in response to natural contradictions, class society is unnaturally imposed upon humanity by a select few. Nevertheless, the contradictions of class society generate material forces that set the masses into motion and plant the seeds of revolutionary consciousness. So, to reiterate, the material conditions created by class society generate dialectical energies that unleash forces challenging class society, as the dispossessed masses forced to live under the boot of the ruling class inevitably respond to not having their fundamental human needs met by class society. This is where the dialectics of revolution comes into play. So, to quote Engels here specifically, the physical forms of motion which become transformed into one another comes more and more to the forefront until finally a point is reached from when on chemical affinity begins to make itself felt. The previously chemically indifferent elements become differentiated chemically one after another, obtain chemical properties, and enter into combination with one another. These compounds change continually with decreasing temperature, which affects differently not only each element but also each separate compound of the elements, changing also with the consequent passage of part of the gaseous matter first to the liquid and then to the solid state, and with the new conditions thus created, end quote. So to quote Marx, all that is solid melts into air. The dialectical relationship between force and motion and the ongoing evolution of chemical compounds lead to fundamental changes in those compounds. This law can also be applied to social conditions, as historical and material forces such as a given historical period's mode of production or the nature of class society create irreconcilable contradictions which ignite forces that bring about new conditions for human development. So, to start with some historical context in Russia from peasant communalism, Narodnism, anarchism, and the Latin development of bourgeois society, to quote from the reading this evening, Reconstructing Lenin, quote, the liberal socialism of Mikhailovsky and his followers, by then in determined opposition to Marx and the Russian Marxists, was occupied with the defense of the economically most exposed and the revitalization of old, antiquated communal models. Lenin traced this eclecticism of the liberal Narodniks to the subjective methodology of the as yet immature science of sociology, which kicked off with utopia and wound up with the most common liberal prejudices, end quote. The profound class antagonisms of lingering and feudalism in Russia, coupled with the sharp contradictions brought about by the recent, albeit limited, introduction of Russian capitalism, brought about eclectic political formulations such as Narodnism and anarchism. So now with the role of the proletariat in Russia, as the young proletariat quickly developed during the ascendancy of capitalism in Russia during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, class consciousness and the rise of proletarian material interests manifested into direct political confrontation with the lingering czarist regime. The proletarianization of Russian cities and towns brought about the formation of Soviets and trade unions. So these mass organizations and strikes are, as I would call them, conscious political manifestations that reflect unconscious or instinctual responses to the material contradictions of capitalism, culminating in the formation of trade unions and Soviets. So, set in motion by historical and material forces, potential revolutionary energy was unleashed by the Russian proletariat at the turn of the century. However, the question of the peasant majority's role in the revolution and resolving the differences between the revolutionary consciousness and that of the young proletariat remained unanswered. For Lenin and the Bolsheviks, this question, despite being riddled with contradictions, could be summarized in the following way. How could this energy be channeled and focalized to ensure it was directed toward the complete overthrow of the czarist regime and the bourgeoisie? So, moving into the experience of 1905 and the formation of the Soviets, to quote the reading as well, Lenin viewed the self organizing public bodies formed during the revolution, and especially the professional systemic traits and political functions borne by the Soviets as a whole, as the special element holding the revolution together. So the Soviets were an independent creation of the young Russian proletariat, and to an extent they also reflected the preliminary political and economic groundwork of the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. Despite the failure of the 1905 revolution, the formation of the Soviets was the logical, self-organized working class response to the rapid deterioration of czarist institutions and political authority. The Soviets would quickly become an arena of struggle between reformists and revolutionaries in maintaining the momentum of the Russian Revolution after 1905. In the beginning, however, the Soviets primarily reflected the will of the Russian working class and peasantry to maintain their political and material interests within class society, as the early formulation of Soviet power operated under the lingering influence of economism, or the Russian social reform movement. Therefore, the modus operandi of class-conscious institutions such as the Soviets and trade unions prioritized the self-preservation of the working and oppressed masses under the boot of autocracy and the rising bourgeoisie, rather than the self-emancipation of the masses from class society as a whole. Lenin sought to change the state of consciousness via an agent of catalytic force that would shift the independent energy of the mass movement from reformist ends to revolutionary ones. This agent would become known in Leninist lexicon as the Vanguard. So, to quote the reading here as well, quote, the principal premise in What is to be Done is quite specific and historical. A revolutionary party capable of overthrowing the autocracy requires an underground organization built on volunteer activity. This can only be a party of professional revolutionaries who are familiar with the rules of conspiracy, the revolutionary consequences of Marxist theory, the history and logic of political and armed struggle, and are aware of the means at the party's disposal. The objective of the party's organization is socialism, but only in the long run. Its immediate political and economic goal is social revolution. The historical stage preceding socialism, to use Marx's term, is the dictatorship of the proletariat. According to Lenin, the historical role of the party is to function as the leader and the catalyst of a movement already in existence, the embodiment of a trend shaping the Russian revolutionary workers' movement. End quote. Lenin's revolutionary vanguard, which would ultimately materialize into the Bolshevik Party in Russia, serves as the catalyst that propels the workers' movement into a domestic and international revolutionary struggle against autocracy, the bourgeoisie, and imperialism, thereby fulfilling the Marxist goal of international proletarian revolution. However, the relationship between the proletarian vanguard and the revolutionary masses is inherently dialectical, as the vanguard's role is characterized by a highly organized theoretical leadership deriving from the most advanced political layers of the revolutionary proletariat, which meticulously evaluates all historical and material circumstances that create revolutionary potential. By contrast, the activities of the broader masses generally continue at a similar pace in response to immediate domestic conditions created by economic and political crises. As Krauz explains, quote, at the very center of Lenin's party building thesis was the issue of how the working class could achieve class consciousness. According to Lenin's analysis, the working class is subject to bourgeois society not only in its generality, but also concretely, since all preconceived notions associated with the capitalist system find their way into the deepest consciousness of workers. The working class is unable to spontaneously rid itself of these preconceived notions. During the first years of his exile in Western Europe, Lenin found that the regime thrusts notions sustaining capitalism into the workers' consciousness, for example, by means of propaganda or the media. From this, he came to the conclusion that there cannot be a revolutionary movement without a revolutionary philosophy. End quote. So, despite the separate and at times contradictory activities of the vanguard and the mass movement, the vanguard and the mass movement must form an insoluble bond in order for a successful proletarian revolution to take place. The vanguard is not to serve as a commanding entity attempting to establish unquestionable authority over the mass movement. Rather, by virtue of the disciplined and concise analytical methods of Marxism, the vanguard channels the energy of the mass movement into a revolutionary seizure of power by the masses under the leadership of the proletariat and the peasantry. Lenin's breakthrough was unequivocally proven by the success of the October Revolution of 1917. So then we move here into after the revolution, when the vanguard is in power or has been in power in history. So after the Bolsheviks had won significant majorities across all of major Soviets in Russia, on November 7th, 1917, the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet proclaimed the end of the bourgeois provisional government and the official establishment of a government fulfilling the Bolshevik vanguard mantra of all power to the Soviets. Within months, the new workers' democracy passed legislation that called for an end of the First Imperialist World War, land reform and redistribution, the right of all oppressed nationalities under the former Russian Empire to self-determination, women's rights, queer rights, and much more. But despite this unparalleled historical achievement, the contradictions laden within a victorious revolution in a peasant majority country quickly rose to the surface, as counter-revolutionary forces armed by capitalist powers within and outside of Russia sought to quickly put an end to Soviet power. In turn, strict war communist policies were implemented by the Bolsheviks to ensure that all needs of the Civil War effort were met, and the vast majority of the workers and peasants fell right in line with the needs of the war effort, despite the limited power of Soviet democratic procedures during this time. This was not a betrayal of the revolution, but rather an imperative necessity in defense of it, as counter-revolutionary forces put the Civil War into motion. As Trotsky aptly pointed out in his book, Terrorism and Communism, a reply to Karl Kautsky, we were revolutionaries in opposition and have remained revolutionaries in power. End quote. The tragic reality of the October Revolution was that even though the Red Army was victorious in the Civil War, the tremendous loss of working class ranks to the war effort, as well as the lack of an international proletarian revolution, maintained the economic backwardness and isolation faced by the young Soviet republics. In turn, Stalinist degeneration or bureaucratic centralism would take hold. This, among many other reasons, is why Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution is so important. But we must also remember that in light of everything that's been discussed throughout this presentation, the rise of Stalinism in the Soviet Union was by no means a product of Leninism. So, in the interest of time, this quote from Chapter 5 of Lenin's State and Revolution will serve as my summary of post revolutionary society. Quote, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e., the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, and the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Democracy for the vast majority of the people and suppression by force, i.e., exclusion from democracy, of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. This is the change democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. Only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, i.e., when there is no distinction between the members of society as regards their relation to the social means of production, only then the state ceases to exist and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. End quote. So, just some concluding thoughts as I wrap up here before our discussion piece. The irrefutable connection between the laws of nature and the laws of dialectical materialism can illuminate our understanding of revolution in theory and in practice. Leninist vanguardism is not averse to democracy, but rather serves as the catalytic force which sets into motion revolutionary workers' democracy and leads the militant defense of this democracy after a revolution takes place via disciplined organization and leadership. And this disciplined militant organization and the entrenchment of revolutionary authority in the face of counter-revolution that seeks to restore bourgeois rule, once again, is not a negation of workers' democracy. On the contrary, this is the only viable defense of any successful revolution, as demonstrated by the Russian Civil War and other historical examples, such as the failure of the Paris Commune. So, as we face a world of growing class consciousness and proletarian radicalization, applying the scientific methodologies of Leninism are crucial to the theoretical and practical understanding of revolution in our lifetime.